scraps into my garden before.
Okay, got it. That's
Hi,
totally good.
this is Hui. I just started my first compost pile, and I'm total beginner as well.
Okay.
Oh,
So when you,
I'm
if
Kelly
you all
Rayhill,
keep
and
yourselves
I'm
muted until you start talking, and then
oh,
you can unmute when you talk. Go ahead.
Kelly, can you? I think that was the name I heard. Kelly, will you cut out on us? Could you tell us again? Oh, which?
A little composting bucket type thing turns at all small. I've been doing that now, so that's all the experience I have.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. We had a little bit of your audio breaking up, but it sounded like you have a little bit going on, maybe a little bit of experience. Not a lot is what I gathered from the broken audio there.
And just so you guys know, we're looking at starting at right at 7:05, and we're looking at about 45 minutes. So that way you guys can plan your evenings, or you know, keep that corner of your house that you've blocked off for yourself. That way you know how much time you've got.
And we are, in the last two classes of this series, we kind of held questions off till the end, but tonight we're going to encourage folks to interact a little bit more. So if you feel like sharing your screen, sharing your face with us, you are more than welcome to. And if you have a question along the way, you can wave your hand like this, or you can send it to Anthony via the chat, and he will interrupt me. And we can address your questions as we go, you know, as long as we kind of keep moving, we can do that. I think it would be great. I was just, as people are filtering in, I was asking if anybody was a total beginner. So I see another wave of hands there. If you want to comment in the chat on that, you can too. It just helps me to know kind of what everybody's level is as we're heading into the. Can you all see the first slide?
Composting 101, yes.
Yes. Okay.
All right.
Got a thumbs up from Sarah. Hi, Sarah.
And just so you guys know, if you want to send a message to me, you can send it privately. But if you'd like everyone to see it, just make sure you've got the everyone in the chat. And stuff. What you all should see in the chat as well, and I'll drop it in there if we have any trouble seeing it. We have Kat put this wonderful outline for the class and sent it to me. She put that together, and I dropped it in the chat. So if you're interested as to what it is we're looking at, or if you would like a general overview, that Lynn Institute Compost document should be in the chat. And if you're on your computer, the chat, you should be able to access it from either the bottom of your screen. If nothing's popped up, there's like the little messenger box. You can click on that and it should take up the right side of your screen. Can I get this? Do you guys see that document? Can I get some thumbs up if you guys see that? Okay, sweet. That compost document. Good stuff. All right. Well, Kat, I think we're good to get started. I know I'm still admitting some folks who are hopping on, and so I'm sure we'll do that. So you ready to get started?
Yes, I actually just figured out how to open the chat, so I'm just quickly looking through some of the comments that people have been making about their composting background. Yeah. So we have no idea how to begin, no experience, only research, new to composting, looking for any places to purchase red irregulars locally. We can talk about that. Newbie, basic knowledge, tumbler composting, somebody with chickens, awesome, composting kitchen scraps, lot of YouTube videos on gardening. That's awesome. Okay, great. Well, I have a good sense now. And if any, as you guys are joining in, you want to mention your experience level or any specific questions, go ahead. So, Anthony, do you want to first introduce yourself since you are the host?
Yeah. My name is Anthony Covey. I am the Director of Collaboratives and Community Engagement with the Lynn Institute. And for those of you who have been on one of the previous sessions we've had, you know a little bit about what we do. And so for those of you who are new, the Lynn Institute is a nonprofit organization here in Oklahoma City. And all of our work is focused on working with vulnerable populations. And some of our most recent work and key work is in Northeast Oklahoma City. And in 2014, we did a research study on the quality of life in Northeast Oklahoma City. And from that, we developed what we call the Healthy Community Collaborative. And it's a great culmination of different civic leaders and organization leaders and stakeholders in the community. And we work together to work on different initiatives and projects, and we do a lot of great work. And I would love to get you more information about our work. And so whenever I follow up tomorrow morning with some of the information that Kat has from this training, like the slides, if you have any questions or anything like that about how you might be able to learn more, get plugged into what we do, shoot me an email, and I'd love to schedule a time to chat with you or correspond via email or anything like that. So we are incredibly thrilled and excited that Kat with OKC Beautiful would develop these sessions with us. And I know Kat has a wealth of knowledge relating to all things green, right? There's not much that I've put in the ground that has thrived for very long. And so I'm learning so much being able to experience these sessions. This is our third session of 5 sessions we currently have planned. And so be sure, if you are interested, to watch on Facebook, both on OKC Beautiful's page as well as the Lynn Institute page, for the future events that are going to come. So thank you guys so much for being on. And Kat, I'm going to toss it over to you.
Okay. Well, I am with OKC Beautiful, as Anthony mentioned. We're really happy to have this partnership with Lynn Institute to present these free gardening classes to you all. OKC Beautiful has been around for about 50 years. We're a nonprofit. We do beautification and environmental education. And many of you may have seen our projects around the city. Our environmental ed is lesser known, but I run a program called OKC Harvest, which is a school garden support program. And OKC Harvest has supported about 24 gardens in schools and community centers around the metro. My background is I started out in kind of small scale organic farming, kind of 2 to 5 acres, managing small farms. And then when I came to Oklahoma, ended up doing some teaching, and I've been doing kind of education on how to grow food on a like tiny to moderately large scale for about 15 years now. So I've had a lot of practice in sort of taking sort of the large scale idea how to farm and bring it down into a postage stamp and how to make it work. And I'm not originally from Oklahoma, but I've been here now over 10 years. So I've been through the ringer with our weather, and I have a good feeling for it, a good sense of it now, so I understand its extremes. So let's go ahead and jump in. I should say this first slide is a picture of one of our composting events or projects we had at one of our schools this past year. We compost with kids, and it is extremely rewarding. We have a pilot program now, which is putting garden educators in schools to showcase what a sustainable garden program in a school can achieve. Sarah Mossman, wave Sarah. She's one of our garden educators, and she actually does the program at Cleveland Elementary, which is in the picture there. So these
I
kids
love composting with those kids. I'm looking at that picture and I just miss them because we haven't been in school since spring break. So that's sweet. Yeah, I miss those guys.
And that pile behind those, or that those kids are documenting, they were recording their information about, was a hot pile, and we're going to talk about how to do that. So just feel like if they can do it, you can do it. And we will do our giveaway here towards the end of the evening of our class this evening, and I'm excited to do that. I have one of these in my backyard and I love it. We have them at Cleveland, we have them at a bunch of our schools, so I'm excited to be able to
Yeah, it's
send
kind
you
of
guys
hard to
one.
hear you.
Okay, maybe I'll take this off and see if it's is that any better?
No.
Okay. Anthony, are you having trouble hearing me?
I can hear you really well. It might be some connection issues or something like that. So shoot me a message, Ben, and let me know over the course of the class if you're having trouble. We might recommend hopping out and hopping back in.
I can hear you and Sarah perfectly fine.
Okay. Yeah. Well,
But
maybe.
not me.
Yeah, it's at the point now where Anthony and Sarah are very loud and Kat is very soft and
Is
Okay.
anybody else having that problem?
Yeah. So yeah, why don't we see if it clears up on its own?
Okay, sorry about that, Ben.
yeah,
Sometimes.
Shireen's saying the same thing.
Okay.
Somebody else says otherwise.
Yeah. No worries. We'll
Okay.
get it figured out.
Okay. Well, if it gets to be where you can't. Oh, are you going to record, Anthony?
Yeah, we're recording right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we are recording it. So there's that. And then if I've had experiences with Zoom where I've had to leave and then go back in, like Anthony said, and it cleared up whatever the issue was. So tonight we're going to talk about what is compost, how to make it at home, what to look for if you're going to buy compost, because you may like all this information but not be ready to jump in yet, and then how to use it. My technically challenged here because my mouse is not, there it is. Okay. All right, so at the last, well, if anybody was in our Gardening 101 class, we talked a lot about this, about how soil, the health of the soil is what relates to the health of your plants. And healthy soil, when you have healthy soil, you have healthy plants, and the healthy plants are able to actually withstand pests and diseases, not unlike humans. How our immune systems work, if we are healthy, we are much less likely to get the diseases, and actually they've proven with plants that pests are less likely to attack them and munch on them when they're robust and healthy. So but what I've learned over the years is that you start with the soil. You don't start with trying to produce a healthy plant. You think about where the roots are and where the nutrition is coming from. So the qualities of the soil that you want are written up there at the top. You want good structure. You want it to be workable. You want to have a lot of air pockets in your soil. You want the soil to be able to hold moisture, but also let the water drain. And you want to have a good organic matter content. And I'm going to explain what that means. If you have low quality soil, it's the opposite. It's hard, it's packed. There isn't a lot of air in the soil. It's hard to dig, not workable. Water will either not go through, or if it does flow in, it'll go right through. Then you can have the other extreme where it just holds too much moisture and it's very waterlogged. So with soil, you're looking for that perfect balance. And of course, if you have a low quality soil, you're not going to have much organic matter in it, and that's going to be the key that we're going to talk about. So here's two examples of soil that is organic matter heavy versus poor. And you can just see, we're talking about fertility here. You can imagine that deep, rich, dark soil is going to be a lot more fertile than the sort of fine, dusty, sandy soil over there in the other hand. Now, we talked about the fact that texture of your soil is something that you're kind of stuck with, like whether you do have a lot of sand or a lot of clay in your soil. You can't really change that. You can't go and add sand or clay to balance it out. But what you can do is you can add organic matter. And when you start adding the organic matter, that's when you're going to start having improvements in all of those things that we're looking for in healthy soil. So what is organic matter? Well, you can kind of guess. It's things like leaves. It's remnants of previously living things, such as plant material or insect bodies that you're going to find out in nature. So when we're talking about compost, you can kind of figure out where we're going. Organic matter is what we put in our compost piles. And this is a review slide too from our Gardening 101 class. So I mentioned that, structure is important. And when I'm talking about soil structure, I'm talking about the soil having air pockets. In our school gardens, we constantly tell the kids not to step on the dirt. And it's a learning curve for everybody, but it's really important because we're constantly working on improving our soil structure and creating those lovely air pockets and channels for water to flow through, and also places for the water to reside when it does receive water, so that it can nourish the roots over time. We want all that space in the soil, so we don't want to step on it and squish all those pockets out. The key to getting those air spaces and pockets in your soil has to do with the organic matter. When you put organic matter in, like your leaves, your straw, your compost that's rich in organic matter, you actually welcome in the microorganisms. So this is a fun slide. I won't say much on this because we covered it last time, but the thing that the soil microbes do is they kind of consume the organic matter. In the process of doing that, they exude these byproducts, which are sticky and gooey, and they act to actually glue the soil particles together. So when you don't have organic matter and microbial activity in your soil, you're going to have your soil particles kind of floating around loosely like this. When you do have a lot of good microbial activity, you're going to have clumps. The technical term is aggregate, but it's just a clump. It's a chunk of dirt that's bound together by these microbial and fungal byproducts. So the bottom line is that when you have organic matter in your soil, you're inviting the soil helpers, the decomposers. So that's going to be everything from the huge night crawlers down to the invisible bacteria that's in the soil. They all work together to break down organic matter and turn it into the beauty in your soil. So where does compost fit into this bit about soil structure? So think about a compost pile as an all-you-can-eat buffet for decomposers. Decomposers are our friend in gardening. Now, I didn't say this at the beginning, but my experience is, I think I did mention that I did organic and sustainable farming, and that's what I bring to the garden. I do everything without chemicals and without pesticides or chemical pesticides, because we want to build up our soil, and the key to building up our soil is that microbial life. Well, the chemicals kill the microbial life. You can argue about all the other reasons why you would or wouldn't want to have chemicals in your garden, but one of the most foundational reasons is that there's life in the soil, and if you spray the stuff on the soil, it's going to kill the microbes. The microbes are going to break down your organic matter and create the fertility that we just talked about. So here we have a lovely compost pile. Let's talk about why compost is so great real quick. This is a little definition of compost: a balanced mixture of decayed organic matter used for fertilizing and conditioning the land. So there's the two terms, fertilizing and conditioning. So the fertility is where the organic matter is feeding the plants. It's basically taking all the nutrients that are locked inside the food scraps and the dead plant material, and it's making it as available nutrition for the roots of the plant. So that's the fertilizing part. And then the conditioning part is what I mentioned earlier about the structure, where we're getting those aggregates to form because of the activity of the microbes in the soil. So, and all of that fertilizing and conditioning lends it to the benefits, which is moisture management. It makes your soil hold water, but also lets water drain well. It actually will buffer your pH. If you have a pH that's a little higher low, adding compost magically balances it, which takes a lot of the guesswork out. And then fertility, we mentioned, we're we're making a slow release fertilizer with the compost in the soil. And then we're taking stuff that would go to the landfill and we're turning it into a resource. And there's a lot of benefit to that. So I like to remind people that compost happens all the time. It's happening all around us. And basically what we're doing is we're just trying to harness what's happening already when we're in our garden or our backyard. So composting basically is the nutrient cycle that happens naturally when the leaves, for example, if you look at this picture and imagine a forest, you know, the leaves fall to the forest floor. Well, because of the decomposers and the life in the soil that's present, that layer of leaves is going to disappear. It's going to be returned to the soil. And it's just this loop that's constantly happening. It's all of those leaves and dead plant material that's constantly feeding all the life that's living in the forest. So that's happening, you know, in your yard. It's happening in a median in the middle of the road. If you throw a banana peel down, you know, in nature, it's going to disappear. Now, it's going to take a lot longer if you throw it on pavement, but the bacteria will eventually get to it even on pavement. That's how, you know, that's how much bacteria is present in our environment. You know, it's all around us, all ready to just decompose everything. So I say this because what we're doing in the garden is we're taking that power of that nutrient cycle that just wants to constantly happen, and we're going to mimic it. So when we harvest our veggies out of the garden, we're taking all the organic matter that the plants have produced, and we're not putting it directly back in the soil, right? We're putting it in our bodies, we're eating it. So what a compost pile in the corner of your yard does, or next to your garden does, is it gives you a place to then take all the food waste and all the yard waste and create that same wonderful stuff that would have naturally been happening had that squash plant fallen and decomposed right onto the roots of the plant, if you're following me. So it's just taking the cycle, it's setting it off to the side, and we pull out the material that we make in our compost pile and we put it back in our garden. Basically, like, you know, saying thank you to the garden is like, here, you know, you gave me something, now I'm going to give it back. And it's this give and take, and it's a nice cycle. So in order to replenish the nutrients we take out, we have to add compost back to the garden. So we talked about this now. The decomposers are responsible for the compost. So obviously you may not want to learn all this or care, but we teach this to our kids because it's interesting. I mean, what causes that banana peel to, like, you know, slowly, or an apple core to slowly like turn brown and then like return to the soil, or a pumpkin to rot? You know, if you ever did a pumpkin experiment with kids in a garden and just let them watch it slowly like shrivel up and melt back into the ground, only to have a new pumpkin plant grow there the next spring, that's the magic of it. And so who's responsible for that? Well, it's bacteria. They are the most abundant of the microbes that are found in compost piles, but in nature, in the environment, they're responsible for the majority of the decomposition. Actinomycetes are microbes that break down paper and wood. We have our fungi, the molds and the yeast, the decomposed materials that the bacteria can't. So a lot of woody things that are tough to break down are the ones that the fungus and the actinomycetes are really good at getting. And then the larger ones that we can see with our eyes, the worms, the roly-polies, slugs, and snails, they will break down the larger waste by munching on it. And sometimes they can't eat those large pieces until the bacteria have softened them. And that's definitely the truth for the worms. They don't have teeth. So they like things to be kind of already slightly, you know, moldy before they get to eating on them. So if you're kind of into this, on your outline, there's a link to some information on the web that's fun to go through to learn about the levels of decomposers and what they're doing in a compost pile, and how they move in and out depending on the temperature of the pile. it's pretty interesting. That little graph at the bottom kind of shows the progression. Here's a fun diagram that shows what they look like, these invisible ones. Kids enjoy seeing this. It's kind of fantastic to think about how many of those are in 1 teaspoon of soil. So a gram of soil is about a teaspoon, and if you look over there, it says 100 million to a billion. I've heard people say as many as 50 billion little bacteria can be in a teaspoon of soil. So it's kind of like a universe that's inside the soil. You know, we have the stars that we can look up at night. Well, we can look into our soil and we can go infinitely the same degree of, like, you know, distance into the inner world of the soil. It just keeps going, and it's very powerful what all those organisms are doing for us in terms of, you know, how we participate with them when we grow food. So the visible decomposers are ones we're friends with for the most part, unless you're kind of new to this and kind of, you know, not that familiar with, like, you know, millipedes and centipedes. And if you do have an outdoor compost pile that's open air, you'll find these critters in there. But once you start composting and you realize that they're helping, it kind of changes your relationship to them if you've ever been kind of squeamish about them before. So all of these characters do help. And then I thought it was neat to include this little quip over here to the side, just about how many millions of worms might be present in an acre of soil and what the amount of fertility that they pump out in terms of their poop. On an acre, like 700 pounds of castings a day that's pumped out into the soil, and that's really a resource if you're farming or trying to grow anything. Okay, so we're going to move on over to the 2 great ways to make compost. Do we have any questions at this point? If you have one, just type it in there or wave your hand. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 2 different ways of composting. There's these 2 kind of extremes, and then there's stuff in between which we can touch on. But I'm going to talk about if you have a pile out, if you want to do an outdoor compost pile, what a hot pile would entail. The picture that you see on the left is kind of what a lot of people have. If they build a pile, they'll take some pallets and make a little area, and they'll put their leaves in there, and maybe their yard clippings and some kitchen scraps will go in there occasionally, and that is great. And that tends to, and it will be built sort of as you go, and we call that a cold pile. It's kind of a static pile. It's not going to break down quickly. It's going to kind of break down in stages. As you add stuff, it's going to break down, and then it'll slow down and kind of sit still for a while until you add some more. Yes.
Ben Bouton, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, he said he has a disagreement in his house, and he wants to know if there are any problems with fruit mold. I think that's what he's asking.
Is the question, Ben, about putting moldy things into your compost pile?
Yeah, putting moldy fruit in, or even moldy milk or anything like that. My wife and I have had a disagreement, and I see you have pictures of mold, and so before I start saying yes, I was right, that I don't, I can absurdly say no, there's nothing wrong with that. So
yeah, you're just adding members of to the party, basically. It's fine. And okay. One of the things I'm going to teach you about is how to balance so that you don't have stinky, smelly, gooey, cesspool type things happening in your compost. That's important. And sometimes with worm bins, people are more concerned with that because they might be in their kitchen or, keeping their worm bin inside. So they might not want to have mold, growing, indoors. And there's ways that you can have a worm bin where you avoid that. And I'll go over that. But to answer your question, it should be fine because you're just adding more like
Okay,
numbers
thank
where
you.
they need to be. So a hot pile is one where you put everything together all at once. So you're going to kind of stockpile your resources and you're going to put them all together in one big composting session. Maybe over the course of an hour you can build, or 2 hours you can build a hot compost pile. And I'll explain that. And then the other example of composting I wanted to share with you is the indoor worm bin. That both of these two options, the hot and the worm bin, will yield you harvest a compost harvest within a couple of months, and that's pretty fun. Okay, so we'll start with hot compost piles. To build a hot compost pile, you have to pay attention to the balance a little bit of what you're putting in there. You want to have your organic matter source, and you're going to have whatever you choose. It's either going to be a carbon source or a nitrogen source. And the carbon sources are the brown things that usually are starchy and dry, like dried leaves. And your nitrogen sources are going to be things that are fresher and greener, recently living, that are actively decaying, like food scraps from the kitchen. Manure falls into that category. You can put like horse manure into your compost pile. You can put grass clippings if it was from a lawn that has not been sprayed. Those are your greens. Other browns would be like straw or twigs. You can use shredded paper that you need to get rid of as your carbon source. And then the other two ingredients are air and water. So as long as you have water, a hose nearby, that's easy. And the air, the air comes into play with how you build your pile. You have to build it with aeration in mind, or you won't get that heat that we're looking for. And I'll talk a little bit about where the heat comes from, but this is just a little summary of the hot compost pile recipe, and this is in the outline for you to download, or download when you get it from Anthony tomorrow. So air, water, your greens, and your browns. So when we do a hot pile, let me just back up and say that one of the benefits of doing a hot compost pile is that when you generate heat, and I should back up one step behind that and say the heat comes from the activity of the bacteria. So when you put all of these greens and browns and water and air together in the right balance, it creates like I said it was like an all-you-can-eat buffet, but it's also, another analogy would be like a rave party where they just get, the decomposers get in there and they start like doing their thing, and they're working so hard to break down this organic matter, and they're just so happy because it's the perfect conditions for them to do that. So their activity just increases, and as they do that, the byproduct of their activity is heat. Kind of like if you can imagine a rave, like people dancing and it getting really hot in the room. That's what I'm trying to express here. It's that as the organisms, the microbes get into breaking this stuff down, they get into a frenzy, and it just generates all this heat. So the benefit for us as gardeners to having a pile that heats up are many. One is it kills diseases that are present in the soil. It will kill off weed seeds. So your compost then becomes cleaner. The results of a cold pile, you're not going to get that benefit of it having heated up. The other main benefit is that it breaks down super fast. Go ahead, Anthony.
Kim Gordon asks, so you can't ever use grass clippings from grass that's been sprayed, or can you use it after a certain amount of time after it was sprayed?
Mm-hmm. There is a period of time for it to break down that makes it safer. And I can't really speak to exactly what that time period is. It would depend on the chemicals that were sprayed, and you could look into it. You could Google whatever it is that's on your lawn and find out what that kind of waiting period would need to be. it has been the case that grass clippings with chemicals on it will go into a compost pile, and then you'll put that compost into your yard and it'll cause problems with seed germination and plant growth. So you do want to be careful. And let me know if there's any other follow-up questions on that. And my email address is on the outline at the last page of the outline for the question that just came in there. Okay, so we're cooking by adding the right balance of all this great stuff to make these microbes happy, do their dance, eat everything, break it down super fast, and create all this heat. So how do you get that beautiful temperature rise? Well, you want to add your organic matter a little thoughtfully if you can. So if you can find organic matter that has this ideal carbon to nitrogen ratio, this is what the microbes kind of get really groovy in. They like 30-1. So if you have like a pile of shredded paper and you throw it on the ground and add water and air to it, it's not going to break down as fast as if you had like, you know, some coffee grounds mixed in with some straw. You know, they kind of work together to kind of balance out to that middle ground. So you want to try to balance out. Now, it's not always easy to do this because you're kind of at the mercy of what you have on hand. So what we say for that is that the rule of thumb is just to add twice the volume of browns as greens. And I'm talking about volume because browns tend to be kind of voluminous. They tend to be fluffier. And so if you try to imagine putting twice as much of the browns as the greens, or twice as much of the carbon as the nitrogen in terms of volume, then you will end up, it tends to end up to work out just right. So, and here's, this diagram doesn't really show you putting in that extra layer, like the extra volume of carbon, because it's kind of squished down, I guess, by the weight in this artist's eye, which is what happens. But the nitrogen tends to be like heavy and wet and smushy anyway when you put it in, and your carbon stuff's going to be fluffy and big. So, and then when it all gets squished down, it kind of looks like it's all the same amount. But rule of thumb, twice the volume of browns to greens, and then you just layer them. You do nitrogen, carbon, nitrogen, carbon, nitrogen, carbon until you get up to the top of your pile. And that's when you start getting this, this ratio to be right. And here's, if you're kind of wondering, like, what do I have on hand that I can put in my compost pile to have this balance of carbon and nitrogen? Well, here's some good ideas for what you can use. What I recommend too is going to restaurants that you frequent and asking if you can have some of their food scraps before they throw them away. And I'm not talking about stuff from people's plates. I'm talking about like their sous chef, you know, like the stuff that gets that's raw and that's clean, and they would, you know, like the tops of carrots and the you know, the peelings of things and the cores of things. We, for our composting at the elementary school, we went to the loaded bowl and we like asked them to save all of their juicing byproducts for like a week. And so I had, you know, my car full of all this like buckets of like rotting, you know, nitrogenous green stuff for a few days. And it got really stinky because there was no oxygen in it. It was just in these buckets with lids and in these old boxes. But then we aired it out and the kids went, ew, and you know, got all grossed out. But then once we put it in the pile, mixed it with the carbon, all that odor went away and the pile was huge, and then it slowly like shrank because it was the perfect ratio. We added to the food scraps, we added straw and leaves, and that was how we built that pile that you saw that first picture of. Trying to get my mouse, there we go. Things that you'll hear this a lot when you're getting ready to build a compost pile. You don't want to put fats and oils. We talked about the grass clippings. You don't really want to put anything that's going to attract rodents or dogs from the neighborhood or even cats to kind of get in there and mess around. Bones, you don't really want in there because they will take a lot longer. Their carbon content's way high. Anything that's big and chunky, if you think about it, it's not going to break down quickly enough to make your hot pile heat up. So like if you have huge stalks from a sunflower that are this big around, you want to cut those into little pieces. They will eventually break down, but if you want your pile to go fast in 8 to 12 weeks, then I would cut them into little pieces. You can lay down a piece of plywood and throw your chunky stuff down and then take a flat shovel and just pound and chop it all at once. And it's kind of a good way to get a workout while you're doing your compost pile. Meat, grains, beans, these things will break down, and they can break down in a hot system, but in your backyard, they're gonna take longer and they're gonna be smelly and they're gonna attract rodents or pests. So it's just a general thing that you don't put that in a backyard pile. Here's some pictures so you kind of get a visual. This over here you can't really see what it is, but we got spent hops from a brewery. So that was a very high nitrogen source there. And then we had straw. So this pile is actually being turned. It was a pile that was big and then it got turned, but they were getting all mixed together. But layers of browns, greens, air, and water. So you see the browns. The browns are kind of light colored and the greens in this case are actually dark. Here's a better picture. This is from that same compost pile we did this last year. You can see the food from the loaded bowl, that vegetarian restaurant I mentioned, and then the leaves that were in there. And the leaves that we used, we got from a landscaper. They just dumped them, and they were sort of already somewhat decomposed. So they were between kind of dried out and then dark brown. And then we added a layer of food scraps, and then the kids added water at every level. And then this is this student here with the pitchfork, I guess she actually has a pitchfork. As you're building your pile, you want to poke holes in it and make air holes as you go. There's other ways that you can get air into your piles.
Kat?
So, yeah.
A couple questions. You want to take them?
Yeah.
So Ben asks, I think he's asking, can you use rice?
You can put rice in. And I would say, like, if you have a little bit of rice here and a little bit of grain there, it's fine. You just don't want to put them in a huge bunch of that. The reason for the rice, the grains, is that they tend to take longer. So the whole idea behind a hot pile is you want to put things in that are going to go quickly. But if you have that and you want to compost it, you can. You would just want to make sure you kind of disperse it through the pile well.
And then one more question is from Teresa. Why do you need to rinse eggshells? I have not been rinsing them. Did that ruin my pile?
No, it doesn't ruin anything. It's just kind of a principle of wanting your pile not to be smelly to attract, marauders, raccoons or whoever's going to be wanting to go lick that clean. So I like to use for eggshells. I like to rinse them out. Another thing you could do is you could not rinse them, and then you could put them on a cookie sheet with some parchment paper, and you could bake them and kind of heat them up and make them dry and crunchy. And that kind of cleans off any moisture on them, and you can kind of use them that way. But if you don't want to go the extra step, it's your call. That's fine. You can experiment with it. And if you don't seem to have a problem with it, I mean, a few eggshells in the middle of a hot pile aren't going to necessarily be a beacon to, a bunch of pests. I'm just trying to make sure people don't go out and put all this stuff in there and then have like the neighborhood dog come and like tear the pile apart. That would suck. So that's kind of the thinking behind that. This picture right here shows the right size. So part of what makes a hot compost pile work is the volume. And it's kind of a mystery as to why this perfect volume is necessary for it to break down super fast, but people have tried. If you make it smaller or you make it a lot bigger, it doesn't get as hot and doesn't break down as fast. And so just experience has shown that this kind of volume, 3 feet high, 3 feet wide, you know, 3 feet long, you know, just like this 3 by 3 by 3 cube works really well. So here's what happens to a pile after a while. It breaks down and it shrinks. And you're like, wait a second, I thought I had all this compost. Well, you do, it's just concentrated. It's broken down. And so it needs to be, so when you get to this point when it's like this, where it's shrunk and it's stopped decomposing, that's when you need to go back in and reinvigorate it by adding water and air, and the process of turning does that. So here's our big pile, and then here's, you can kind of see, this picture is not perfect because it's at different levels, but it kind of, this picture is basically shrunk in half. And there's a little compost thermometer in there. They're looking to see what the temperature is of their pile. Our pile that we made this past fall got up to 120, and it stayed up there for probably 2 weeks, Sarah, would you say? 2 weeks?
Like a while, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then it was still hot through, we built it in the fall, and so we took the temperature every day, we analyzed it, but then we got some pretty cold days there, like in the winter, earlier before we went on winter break, and then we came back and it was still like insanely warm. I mean, it was surprisingly warm through the cold weather.
It's really fun to see that happen, you know, and you can actually pull the compost pile back and stick your hand in and feel it. Or when you pull your compost thermometers have like a long arm on them, and when you pull it out, you can feel the heat on them. It's really fun for kids to see that in action, and it really opens doors in their minds about like this invisible world of science that's going on inside their compost pile. Does anybody have any questions about how the heat happens, or how to make your pile heat up, or the why of it? Okay, if you do, just tap your questions in there. So here's some examples. This was in the earlier slide, this pallet bin, and then this picture right here is kind of something that represents like a static pile. And I don't want to discourage anybody from doing this, because there's a lot of value in not working. Everybody works hard, and you know, you don't necessarily want to do all this, but just know that it's just going to take time. And like this pile of grass clippings and leaves is going to yield beautiful compost. It's just going to take time. And if you wanted to speed up a pile of grass clippings and leaves, you would do it by taking that cage off and then physically moving it back into the cage. That action of turning it would really add a lot of air, which would bring life to the microbes. And then as you did that, you could add water, and then you would see your pile shrink more. So that's an option. You can do this kind of periodically. This, you know, adding air and water to your static piles will go a long way to moving them along. Somebody mentioned they have a tumbler. I have a tumbler in my backyard. This is a tumbler right here. This is a tumbler. What's nice about that is you can kind of cheat and have your stuff be aerated by turning, and you can pour some water in there and then turn it. And it's kind of like, it's like cheating a little bit, because you don't have to, you know, build your pile all at once, but you can still get that air and water and aeration going. And another thing you can do with the tumbler is you could have a pile of like dried straw or leaves next to it, and every time you add some kitchen scraps, like some nitrogenous green kitchen scraps, you can then add a handful of dried leaves. And so you're kind of adding in the right ratio as you go, and then you turn your tumbler, so you can kind of heat up your tumbler. I have had my tumbler heat up because I've done that. It's just like taking this concept and doing it on a micro scale. I see the question, are the tumblers considered hot compost or cold compost? So it depends on how you use it. If you just throw your stuff in there, like I do a lot of the time, just open the lid, throw it in and walk away, that's gonna be cold. But if you add your kitchen scraps, you take the time to add a little bit of browns with your greens, add water and turn it, it's gonna heat up. You're gonna have a little bit of decomposition that goes on in there. So with a tumbler, it's kind of a hybrid, I would say. And then these green and black twin pair of bins here that you see are another way that you can go in a backyard in an urban setting where you might be kind of concerned about animals getting into your open hot pile. This is nice because it's pretty secure from that. And you can build it all at once like you did, like I just described. You can fill it up to the top at the right ratio, and it'll break down. And the door at the bottom is designed so that you can start pulling out the stuff that breaks down first without having to pull it all out from the top, because the good stuff's going to be at the bottom. Any more questions on hot piles, just let me know. I got to make sure I'm not going over time-wise because I can't see my clock here. Let's see where we're at. I got to really hurry up. So real quick on worm bins. Anybody ever done a worm bin before? Wave your hand. Worm bins are, people don't realize that it's an option. We do worm bins with kids. They absolutely love it. It's not scary. The nice thing about worm bins is that 1,000 worms can make you, 3.5 pounds of compost per month and 40 pounds in a year. And that's with very little effort. It can be done on a small scale or a large scale, but the nice thing is you could do it inside year round and it's easy. So, people produce a lot of food waste, and one person, if everybody had their own personal worm bin, we would reduce landfill, waste by a lot. Somebody asked, I think earlier, where to buy worms. This is where I recommend. Recently, there's been a worm shortage because I think so many people have been gardening during lockdown that they ran out. But you can also find somebody who has a compost pile and ask them for a handful of worms. This is my daughter here scouting for worms in a neighborhood compost pile from an urban farm, and that was how we started a pile rather than ordering them. And this picture here is to show you what a good size worm bin could be. A 10-gallon container like that is just fine. So to build a worm bin, you just need some bedding for them, which could be shredded newspaper. It has to be moist. You could also use peat moss. You can use cocoa peat. These are good examples of things that the worms can use as bedding. It's a soft, moist place for them to live, and then they can also snack on it as well. You need that airflow in there because it's nice, light and fluffy material. Shredded paper is good unless it gets kind of matted. You have to watch for that. When you first create your worm bin, you want to leave the top off for a few days so the worms will get oriented to which way is up and which way is down. And then you just feed them regularly. We do a coffee and composting session now. OKC Beautiful does, where you come and drink coffee and build a worm bin. We had to cancel ours this year, but we'll be doing it again. These are two of our participants walking out with their worm bin. Can worms be put into a tumbler? Yeah, they can. The thing about tumblers is they're not connected to the ground. So if your tumbler is going to heat up, it's going to be too hot for worms, and they can't easily escape like they could if the pile was sitting on the ground and it got too hot. See, what happens with hot piles is when they heat up, the organisms that don't like that heat are going to escape. They're going to go away and they're going to wait in the wings until it cools off, and then they're going to come back in and start munching on things that didn't get broken down by the heat producing decomposers. So I guess thinking about it out loud, I probably wouldn't. For Clark, my bins keep failing. Well, maybe I'm think I've been too long-winded on the hot pile, so I didn't talk enough about the worms, but I will give you a few tips here at the end. Here's a list of what you can typically put in your worm beds. It's kind of similar to the hot pile. You just want to make sure that things are, you don't have to pay as much attention to the nitrogen carbon ratio in there because the worms eat everything so fast it doesn't really matter. But you want to make sure you don't overfeed or underfeed. That's where the balance comes in for worm beds. So things you're going to see in a worm bin, you're going to use red wigglers because they are smaller. They can live in 6 to 8 inches. Earthworms and night crawlers don't like to be that shallow. So you want red wigglers. This is what their egg sacs look like. There's just a lot to learn about worms. But inside your worm bin, if it's an indoor bin, you're not going to see a lot of other decomposers. You might see a little mold from time to time. And if that happens, you just kind of toss the contents and add a little bit of bedding to kind of cover it up. If you keep food buried, it doesn't really mold. I put this in here. It's an example of one of the sheets we use with the little kids at school. It's good for adults too if you're trying to do a worm bin at home. It kind of illustrates what you're looking for and what you need to be looking for if your bins are not working out on a daily basis. You know, you want to be constantly monitoring the smell, the moisture level, how much food are they eating, what are the worms doing, do you see any baby worms, do you see cocoons, and then take all that information and kind of you know, monitor and react. Let's see here. This is same thing, but for the older kids in words, not pictures. But you get the idea. If you want to observe your worms and kind of see what's going on. And I recommend making a little homemade sifter. Or if you're going to keep a worm bin at home, this is a 1/4 inch hardware cloth kind of nailed to some wood. There's lots of different ways to harvest your castings, and I put some links on your outline for things to explore that way. We like to just take it right out of the bin and kind of jostle it back and forth. The worms stay up on the, if there's any worms, they'll stay up on the sifter. Good stuff will fall through, and then you take the chunky parts out and put it back in the bin to finish. Now there's still going to be worms that fall through, so what you do is that's a shallow tub that you're looking at, you just let that sit out in the light, and you kind of move the compost back and you can remove it. There's different ways that you can get the worms out. I kind of touched on this already, just why vermicomposting and composting in general is so important, just how much food waste we generate per day. You know, in our society, each person is responsible for about 4.5 pounds of food waste on average per day. And that can be taken care of by a worm bin. So it's something to think about. And of course, food waste in a landfill causes problems. And I don't want to go into it now because I've been talking too long on everything else. But this is just something we talk with our kids in school about, you know, why composting is so important. You know, what problems we could prevent in the world environmentally if we all composted our food waste. So I want to talk before we go about places to buy compost. So I've tried to impart the importance of using compost, but if you can't make it or you're not ready to make it, these are some good options. Locally, there's a couple of places that are making high quality compost in the ways that I just described, and that would be Commonwealth Urban Farm and Fertile Ground. These links are in your outline. Minnick Materials, they've had a shortage with all of the uptick in gardening, but I'm not sure where they're at now. They make it locally as well. It's on a much bigger scale, but they make it locally. And then TLC has bagged options that are pretty good quality. Organics OKC as well. They just suffered a fire, and I don't know what their status is. Home Depot has the Kellogg brand, which is OMRI approved, which is used and certified organic, and it's a good option. You just have to make sure that you don't, some of their products are very woody, so you want to make sure that you offset it by maybe adding a little bit of fertilizer. And then this is a calculator if you're building a raised bed to try to figure out how much cubic feet of material you would need for your size garden. When you're looking at compost, buying it, you want to kind of evaluate its quality. This stuff in the wheelbarrow that you see that these kids are shoveling is the Hume Alpha that I recommended from TLC. We use this in our school gardens because it's really well broken down. When we have to buy compost, that's what we buy. And it's a combination of alfalfa and chicken manure, but it's broken down enough that it's not offensive when it comes out of the bag. It can be if it's wet, but generally it's dry. Really good quality stuff and has good texture. You want to think about how it was made. So if you're buying something that wasn't produced in a hot system, then you're going to find weed seeds and diseases. You know, I know like the city of Norman has a municipal composting facility, and you can go get compost for free from them. But that does tend to have a lot of weed seeds in it. I think it's just hard for them to have uniformity when it comes to the heat. So just stuff to consider. And then some tips on using your compost with worm castings. A tablespoon to a quarter cup per plant is enough because it's so concentrated. Here's some kids exploring some slightly finished, not quite finished compost that's full of critters and identifying them. And then when